Hello, everybody. Sorry I couldn't be there today, but guess what? I'm here. I'm up on the let's see if you're facing you're on top right-hand corner. Yeah, that's me. I'm Mr. Ansharsky. Hi, welcome. So, by now you have started looking at the bell work, and the bell work is right here. Take some time. Look at that bell work right there. I'll read it to you because I'm here. I'm here. I'm beer. No, this is a new video, by the way. This is the first time I've recorded, maybe the last time I'll ever record for AP World. Fingers crossed. No, no, you're great. Anyway, video right there. So let's do the bell work here. So we got John Stuart Mill on Liberty. I'll read it to you. So you got two questions right there. According to the passage, if someone dies from drinking poison, who is at fault? And then, do you agree with the passage? Why not? But let's read the passage. Restrictions on trade or on production for purposes of trade are indeed restraints, and all restraint is an evil. The sale of poisons opens a question. The proper limits of what may be called the functions of government and police. How far may liberty be legitimately invaded for the prevention of a crime or accidents? It is one of the undisputed functions of government to take precautions against crime before it has been committed. However, the preventative function of government is far more liable to be abused against liberty. If poisons were never bought or used for any purpose except the commission of murder, it would be right to prohibit their manufacture and sale. They may, however, be wanted not only for innocent but useful purposes, and restriction cannot be imposed in the one case without operating in the other. When there is not a certainty, but only a danger of mischief, no one but the person himself can judge of the sufficiency of the motive which may prompt him to incur the risk. In this case, therefore, he ought, I conceive, to be only warned of the danger of drinking poison, not forcibly prevented from exposing himself to it. So, take like a minute more, perhaps. Work on this bell work right here. Maybe whatever teachers in the room will pause the video just for a second. Looking at you, good sir. Haha, little trick of the eye, so to say. Anyway, all right, let's assume that the video has been paused and you have done bell work for about 5 minutes ever since the beginning of class, maybe 7 minutes. And let's go ahead and get started with the lesson today. Well, today we're going to take a look at some of the ideas that will emerge as a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. So we're going to really look at both kind of ideas supporting kind of the way things are, and then we'll look at some ideas criticizing the way things are. Lesson objectives or lesson targets today explain the causes and effects of economic strategies of different states and empires. More on that later. And then I can explain the development of economic systems, ideologies, and institutions and how they contributed to change in the period 1750 to 1900. Well, first, we're going to take a look at ideas that support the current status quo of the Industrial Revolution. Yesterday, or last chapter, I should say, we talked about some of the economic hardships and difficulties faced by the Industrial Revolution working class, that proletariat. We talked about class divisions emerging between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. We talked about the middle class. But what are some of the ideas that are largely believed in by this middle class to justify why they are in power? And what is the role of government in supporting industrialization? Well, the first ideology we're going to take a look at is something we've been referencing, I've been mentioning for quite some time throughout this week, and that is the idea of laissez-faire. Well, laissez-faire is an economic belief. It roughly translates to, in French, let it do, let them be, basically. But essentially, it is going to be an idea of limited government intervention in the economy. It largely is going to be a reflection of the economic and political theories of an Enlightenment thinker named Adam Smith. Adam Smith, your name, or that name is probably going to pop up if you ever take an economics class, certainly if you take one here at the great university high school. But laissez-faire really is the brainchild of this particular Enlightenment thinker. Now, remember, one of the big focuses of the Enlightenment is natural rights, namely to property. Government should not restrict the acquisition or handling of said property. That's what Adam Smith is going to argue in his book On the Wealth of Nations, 1776. Same year, of course, as the Declaration of Independence in the United States. A lot of direct parallels between Smith's arguments and what we see happen with the political revolutions of Unit 5. But anyway, what else do we mean by laissez-faire? Well, like I said before, laissez-faire proponents, especially guys like Adam Smith, largely are in favor of this idea of protection of private property, and that government, in its role, should refrain from intervening with that property. Government, according to these laissez-faire thinkers, is really responsible for kind of three things. Make sure that people have private property, protect people who own property, ensure that there is stability, aka police force, aka military. And third, an empire, a government, should also acquire colonies overseas. But beyond that, there's really limited amount of government intervention. Rather, what drives markets? What drives the economy? Well, largely it is, according to Adam Smith, the notion of the supply and demand, the invisible hand. Now, if you've taken a class with Miss Cassidy here, you've learned about the invisible hand, that our demands, that the consumer public's demands, that's what motivates the rise and fall of prices. And that a healthy economy is one that respects that, respects these so-called natural forces, where supply and demand ultimately drive the economy. If something acquires supply in the form of limited intervention at the workplace, then that's perfectly acceptable. That's the invisible hand right there, that the market is what drives industrialization. So really, in Western Europe, North America, we do not see much government help in beginning industrialization. That's a really important point to remember. The governments of Western Europe and North America largely do not intervene in the economy. They also do not help directly support industrialization. Industrialization in Western economies, like North America, like Western Europe, largely done through these invisible hand forces, by the demand of consumers, by the entrepreneurial spirit of factory owners and the bourgeoisie. But the implication of kind of laissez-faire, and of course the main point of it, is that private ownership of the means of production. What this means is individuals, rather than the collective, rather than government, they should own and operate businesses. That's laissez-faire. That's laissez-faire capitalism in a nutshell. No government in the economy, let them be. However, there are kind of some positive and negative side effects of this way of thinking. Because laissez-faire, well, I'll take the defense of it for a second. There is some positive elements to it. Because in an unregulated market where people are allowed to make their own businesses, where they're allowed to kind of be their own captains of industry, so to say, well, that does mean that there are multiple businesses competing to sell to the market. And in order to meet the needs, the growing demand of the market, these businesses are going to have to innovate if they want to make a profit. So kind of technological innovation comes, you could argue, from laissez-faire, unlimited capitalist competition in a capitalist environment. But we also see that the argument is that laissez-faire is a self-correcting system, meaning that even though there might be economic hardships, even though there might be slumps, well, eventually there will be an innovative solution to an issue revolving around the economy. So there will be depressions that happen. There will be downturns. There will be recessions. There will be unemployment. But eventually there will be self-correcting forces that address those problems. Maybe a factory is going to come up with a new innovative technique that requires more employment. So if we let the market be, maybe it will fix itself. But also there's kind of this argument that in a capitalist environment, that's really is going to produce hardworking people. Capitalism, laissez-faire ideas, there is the profit incentive. And if your incentive is to make as much money as possible, you're going to have to work really hard. So kind of there's a cultural positive aspect of laissez-faire. You could make the argument. You could argue that with this profit motive in a capitalist laissez-faire environment, I'm going to work super duper 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 hard to make a lot of money. And as such, you improve society morally. You encourage industry. You encourage ideas of self-improvement. And yet, as you saw with the factory work simulation, kind of no government intervention in the economy, allowing business owners to do and treat their workers however they want, it can lead to bad practices. Furthermore, laissez-faire thinking can lead to monopolization. It can lead to businesses kind of establishing unethical practices to control the market. And these monopolies, they can do whatever they want. If they have ownership, 100% ownership over a business, over an industry, over a natural resource, they can do whatever the hell they want with that resource. You'll learn more about that probably from the guy sitting over there. But another negative aspect of laissez-faire, as we saw yesterday, is this idea of income inequality. Lots of rich people having lots of money at the expense of paying their workers really low wages. And they're able to pay these low wages because there are no government safety regulations at this time. Really, not until the end of the 1900s, or excuse me, not until the end of the 1800s, do we start to see some improvement in the working conditions of factories and other businesses. But of course, even though profit can be a positive motivator for in terms of self-improvement, profit also, well, that's greed right there. And you could say what you want about greed. Is it good? Is it bad? Well, greed can lead to kind of corruption. It can lead to bribery in the government system. And you'll talk about that a lot more in AP US history next year, actually. So kind of this chart right here illustrates the kind of positive aspect of laissez-faire in a environment where it allows entrepreneurs to do what they want. They can come up with their own solutions to problems that will improve the efficiency of the economy. So if there's no or minimal interference of the government, individuals have creative freedom. They can do what they want to incentivize, to maximize profits for the economy. And hopefully that trickles down to the rest of society. That's kind of the positive framing of laissez-faire right there. But to justify laissez-faire of why the government shouldn't intervene, well, we're going to see that there are different quote-unquote pseudo-scientific justifications for the lack of government intervention. A pseudoscience is its fake science, basically. It's not rooted in biology. It's not rooted in physics, not rooted in the natural sciences at all. And there's really kind of two big thinkers that will be used as justification for no government intervention in the economy on a quote unquote scientific basis. One of those is this guy right here named Thomas Malthus. Now, last year in Human Geo, probably, you talked about Thomas Malthus and his theories. And his main theory was that as population rises, there aren't enough natural resources for everybody. So he is going to argue that it's only inevitable that as population increases, some will have resources and others don't have resources. And according to Malthus, the kind of way to solve poverty in this scenario is, well, to prevent population increase. In order to prevent a society, in order to prevent a society in which there are a limited amount of resources for a growing population, you need to, well, curb population somehow. How do you do that? You make it so that the people who are, quote unquote, incapable can't have children. You make it so that poor people don't pass on their genes to the next generation. So the way to solve the inequality of natural resources is to make lesser people not have kids. You can understand why this is not a very popular idea in the current day. It's very, eugenicsy, and you'll learn more about that later in this class. But Malthus is also going to argue that government shouldn't step in to redistribute resources, that there shouldn't be any social welfare from the government, because clearly we don't want to encourage poor people. We don't want to encourage bad traits. If poor people get handouts, they're just going to keep asking for more and more handouts. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you can believe whatever you want. I don't personally believe this. I'm just using Malthus's logic right here. Malthus is a weird guy. He's the kind of guy who's like, you teach a man to fish, you don't give him fish. You know what I'm saying? All right. Well, a more important kind of pseudoscience to justify why there shouldn't be any government intervention, especially in the way of charity, especially in the way of social welfare, is this dumbass nerd right, or this dumb nerd right here, Herbert Spencer. And Herbert Spencer is going to really adapt what is called social Darwinism. Underline this, star this, do something to indicate you need to know what this term means. Social Darwinism is a misinterpretation of Charles Darwin's theories, and it postures this. It postures that all nature is about the survival of the fittest. Charles Darwin never wrote that in any of his books. He wrote things like, it is the species who is most adaptable to change that survives. Whereas Herbert Spencer is going to take Charles Darwin's theories of evolution and apply them to political and social realities. He is going to argue that since survival of the fittest is a natural law, we're going to apply that to human society. And he is going to argue that, well, clearly, if you're poor, it means you are not fit enough. It means you have some sort of moral and genetic defect that should not be encouraged. Rich people, by contrast, clearly they have some positive genetics behind them. Clearly, these rich people, they have, well, some good traits. He's going to argue that rich people are the fittest and they deserve all of their money, basically. You're going to see in Unit 6 and in Unit 7 that people will also start applying this to race as well. Why are Western Europeans so rich and wealthy and powerful? It's because they're clearly the stronger race of people. So yeah, social Darwinism, a major political philosophy of the 19th century, and it's used by defenders of laissez-faire to justify no government intervention. It's nature that some people are poor and some people are rich. We shouldn't interfere with that. That's Herbert Spencer's argument there. All right. Now, before we continue, are there any questions? I'm just throwing that out there to everybody. Yeah, what's your question? Okay. Yeah, you can definitely see that in how the factory game simulation went. You know, I retorted when you guys said, "Oh, it's not fair that I died. Oh, it's not fair that my finger got chopped off." Well, you should have been made better, basically. You should have had better genetics, you dumb worker, you simpleton, you prole. All right. Well, anyway, what's the political implications of all of this? Well, we're already seeing all of the political implications of this straight away. It means that all nature is survival of the fittest. It means that we shouldn't intervene in that. Let the market handle it out. And as such, it is going to help justify kind of why we saw those low wages in the Industrial Revolution. It's why we saw the long, dangerous working conditions. But as we just saw with social Darwinism and Thomas Malthus, there's this argument as well that we shouldn't prop up these poor people. We shouldn't have a social safety net. So you can kind of see that these pseudoscientific ideas are being used to justify no government intervention. It's only natural. We're all competing for resources. Now, what we mean by the term social safety net is this. It basically means government protections and financial aid for its poorest citizens. Talk to your neighbor, explain laissez-faire. A minute has passed. Let's see how people respond to this unregulated capitalism. Well, one of the responses to kind of laissez-faire capitalism is a political/economic theory known as socialism. Now, you guys might have very strong opinions about socialism. I am just going to explain it in a historical context. What do we mean by socialism? Because some elements of socialism are in practice in countries around the world in the present day. But what is it? Well, socialism as a theory is the idea that rather than individuals owning factories, rather than there being one owner, rather there being a boss who owns a business, rather than having kind of private ownership of the means of production, rather workers should own the means of production. So take a car factory, for example. In a capitalist system, that car factory would be owned by, I don't know, Henry Ford. Henry Ford would set the wages, he would buy all the supplies, and he would pay the workers some set wage. Well, in socialism, the idea is that the people at the factory, they would own an equal share of the factory. They would have a democratic, in theory anyway, voice over who owns the factory. And kind of in order to institute this on a national scale, socialists believe in having the government stepping in to kind of own the means of production. That's what we mean by the term nationalization. The means of production, those are the businesses, those are the factories. In capitalism, they are owned by individuals. In socialism, they're owned by the collective. And what's the best representation of the will of the collective? It is the government. So socialists want kind of the private individuals who can become corrupted, well, them to be removed, and for the workers themselves to own and operate the factories. They get to determine what the wages are. They get to determine how long the working hours are. And in general, socialists also believe in having government protections for the workers, having things like a minimum wage, having things like basic a length of how long you can work, things like no child labor, for example. They want to really protect what we call workers from labor exploitation. They don't want these abuses, that's me hitting you, they don't want these abuses against the workers. Now, the theories of socialism are going to really be around ever since the French Revolution, but they start becoming articulated by the mid 1800s. Now, the Enlightenment is going to inspire socialism in the form of this idea of the right to revolution. Because socialists, they're going to argue that the best way to bring about this type of government is through revolution. One of you mentioned this idea of, are there any revolutions against this unequal class hierarchy? Well, guess what? There will be in the 20th century. More on that later. But they're influenced by the ideas of socialism. But the revolutions of 1848 were also important in leading to the rise of socialism. The revolutions of 1848, simply put, they were revolutions by the middle class against monarchies. And actually, even though they didn't see the overthrow of monarchies, these revolutions, kings and queens in Europe, they are going to concede to constitutional monarchies. They concede to a parliament. However, we see that these parliamentary monarchs, these governments, are still owned now by rich people. So there's going to be a lot of workers who say, hey, we fought in these revolutions of 1848, and yet who ended benefiting from them were middle-class people. They're going to say we need a new revolution against middle-class dominated governments. And who best to articulate this theory than a German philosopher named Karl Marx? Now, Karl Marx was a German philosopher, and he is observing, along with his best friend, his probably gay lover, no, they weren't gay, his best friend, Friedrich Engels. They are going to observe the condition of factory workers in unregulated capitalism. They go to England, they go to Germany, and they see the condition of workers. And they're going to team up together, and they're going to write what is called the Communist Manifesto. And essentially, the Communist Manifesto is an attempt to explain why Europe is the way that it is in terms of the unequal distribution of wealth. And they're going to conclude that history essentially is a cycle. It begins with feudalism. As time goes on, feudalism declines in favor of mercantilism. As time goes on, mercantilism declines in favor of capitalism. But Marx and Engels are going to say, they're going to say that eventually industrial capitalism will be replaced by socialism. Marx, and this is what we call Marxism, Marx is going to argue that eventually workers will become so fed up with the industrial capitalist nature that they're going to overthrow that system and implement what they call a dictatorship of the proletariat, where workers control the means of production and the government. Eventually, according to Marx, this is going to transition into a new type of economic theory known as communism. Now, communism in theory, according to Marx, is a society in which eventually this socialist government would be dissolved. We would not need government anymore because we would transition into a classless, moneyless, governmentless, secular society. Marx is really kind of the father of this theory of communism. And his theory of communism essentially is that eventually there will be a revolution against capitalism, then there will be socialism implemented, but eventually over time, that socialist government would be dissolved in favor of kind of workers doing their own thing, everyone working for the good of the community, hence the name communism. Now, we're going to see that the goals of communism, well, they'll try to be implemented in the 20th century, but in many cases to disastrous effects. Communist ways of thinking will influence the Russian Revolution. It will influence the Chinese Revolution of 1949. More on that in Unit 7. However, there is one more theory that we need to talk about, and that's going to be a theory called anarchism. Now, anarchists are going to sound a lot like communists, and in many ways they are similar. But anarchists believe in immediate revolution now. We are going to completely go from capitalism to instant no government through a violent uprising. Anarchists believe in abolishing every hierarchy out there. They believe in abolishing government. They believe in abolishing capitalism. They believe in abolishing things like racism and sexism. Now, say what you will about government, it kind of is necessary, at least in my personal opinion. Say what you will about the economy, it tends to benefit when there's some centralized planning, but that's just my opinion anyway. So we do see that anarchism is kind of the extreme form of all of this. They want a violent revolution now so that workers, well, they get to decide for themselves how to operate their businesses. So Marxists or socialists or communists, all three of those are kind of synonymous for our purposes. Don't talk to Mr. Davidowitz about this. He will make adjustments to how I'm describing all of this. But kind of communists and yeah, that's their theories there. Now, if you have any questions about this, I'll save time on Tuesday for you to ask any questions you have. All right. Well, if you have time, I would watch this video that I will post in the lecture presentation. It's a pretty good description of what we mean by communism, what we mean by socialism, and it also kind of illustrates what Marx thought about all of this. It's a good opinion. It's a good opinion piece. Now, I would like you to take a minute or two. I would like the whoever is in the room to pause the video if that's possible, to explain what these three things are in your own words. And then, how are these ideas responses to the Industrial Revolution? All right. Well, those are the theories behind a lot of different things. But what about the actual practice? How do you implement changes? Because what we just talked about was theories, and theories are nothing without actions. Well, one way that some of these ideas eventually get leaked into government is through labor unions. And labor unions are what we call organized labor. Organized labor, labor unions, they are the same thing. But what is a labor union? Well, many of you probably know what a union is by now. But a union is an organization of workers at a place of business who collectively act as one group of people. And this one group, they are going to negotiate with bosses for better pay, better conditions, shorter hours. And if the boss refuses to meet the demands of these unions, well, what are these unions going to do? They're going to go on strike. They essentially stop work. Now, governments respond to these strikes very brutally, especially in the early Industrial Revolution, because they don't want to give up laissez-faire capitalism. So organized labor, well, it is going to be kind of one response to the injustices of the Industrial Revolution. They're going to demand things like an 8-hour workday. They're going to demand things like a shorter, they'll demand things like higher wages. They'll demand things like ending child labor. So kind of this is happening on the individual workplace level. Unions aren't really a political force inherently. Rather, they are at the local job site. So say that this was McDonald's. Say that all of you were McDonald's employees because given the state of your grades. Just kidding. No. Working at a fast food is a fine and noble profession. But anyway, say that you guys don't like your pay at McDonald's. Well, if you guys all work together as a union, you're going to walk up to your boss and you're going to say, "Hey, dude, if you don't raise our pay, we are going to quit." And the boss can say, "Fine," or he can, or they, the boss can be any gender. I'm not a sexist. I love women and non-binary people. The boss, they can say whatever they want, basically. They can negotiate, "Hey, fine, I want to keep you guys," or they can, you know how negotiations work. You know what they say? The negotiations are short. Anyway. One of the first unions, actually, in world history, at least in terms of the modern perspective of them, is from Britain, actually. And that's where we get the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union by this socialist guy right here, Robert Owen. Robert Owen is one of the first union organizers in at least Western modern history. However, these labor unions eventually are going to say, well, we need change beyond just the workplace. We need to have the government step in to provide some protections for the lower classes. Because we can't go on strike all the time when our minor little grievances come up. We need the national government to help us out. And actually, we do see that one response to kind of all of these terrible conditions is that labor unions eventually pool their resources together to form what are called labor parties. Now, a labor party is a political party that represents the interests of the proletariat, of the working class, of the laboring class. And these workers, well, they're going to vote for representatives who then will introduce laws into government to make sure that there is a national standard for fair labor practices. And these labor parties pop up across Western Europe, to a lesser degree in the United States. But kind of an early example of a labor party is the Chartist Party. Now, the Chartist Party was a specific labor party in England, in Great Britain. And this organization is going to emerge to represent the working class in England's parliament. England has a representative government, even though they have a king at this point in history, or well, a queen at this point in history. But this Chartist movement, this is going to organize workers into demanding the following things of their national government. The Chartists are going to demand that the English government pass a law that has basic worker protections, no child labor. They're also going to demand for reforming the government, to have the voices of working class people. In places like England and in places like Germany and France, actually, in order to vote, you needed property. But these labor parties, they are going to argue that we should extend the right to vote to a greater amount of people. Now, eventually, we do see that there will be some success of these political parties in implementing reform. They are going to listen to the demands of unions to pass laws that protect workers. We eventually see that by the end of the 19th century, there will be worker protections for Western European workers and Northern European and North American workers. But why are governments going to agree to these protections? Why are these governments made up of middle class bourgeoisie people going to agree to worker reforms? Well, there's a couple of reasons. And one of them is to prevent revolutions. Now, there's a difference between the word reform and revolution. A revolution, you're completely changing the system. Whereas with reform, you're making slight edits, you're making fixings, you're fixing it basically, making small adjustments to continue the same political structure. Now, a reform, if you solve some of the problems facing working class people, then maybe they won't do a revolution. And actually, we are going to see that governments in Europe that are dominated by the middle class, they are scared of a socialist revolution. They fear that unless workers have some of their demands met, these workers could organize as one and overthrow capitalism. So kind of in order to kind of diminish the popularity of socialism, some governments, like those in England, like those in Germany, like those in the United States, they are going to agree to some worker protections. Because if we make some concessions to the working class, maybe we can keep the same political structure as we've always had. Maybe there won't be a revolution in our country if we solve some of the problems facing the country. And actually, it's because of this that we don't see any socialist dominated governments in Europe until the 20th century. And we're going to talk about the example of Russia in Unit 7. I keep saying Western Europe because Western European governments do make these concessions. Eastern European governments, namely Russia, does not. And these workers in Russia, as you'll learn in Unit 7, they're going to be pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed until eventually they conclude that the only rational way of solving their problems is by getting rid of the old government and replacing it with a new one. More on that later. Now, another reason why governments agree to some reforms is that members of the middle class, they're going to look at the factories and they're going to say, gosh, are we doing this? Are we contributing to the problem? Are we paying our workers enough? And some middle class people, they're going to say, well, they're morally outraged by capitalism. They're going to be morally outraged by laissez-faire capitalism. And they're going to introduce at least some restrictions on private property ownership. And they're going to introduce some regulation into businesses. But another reason why governments are ultimately going to grant these worker protections is that by the 1860s, most countries in the Western world have extended the right to vote to all men, at the very least, all white men. We're going to see that there is this expansion of democracy because of pressure to prevent revolutions. Let's give them a say in government so they don't overthrow us, basically. And indeed, by the end of the 19th century, there are some protections for workers. As I just mentioned, there eventually is the extension of the right to vote to all men by the 1860s. 1870 in the United States, all men are allowed to vote regardless of race. But we also see that there is change in government. Governments before the end of the 19th century were made up of really rich people who would, well, they would appoint their friends into key government offices. But in the 1800s, the late 1800s, in order to solve issues of corruption and bribery of rich people paying for government jobs, we see that most countries in the Western world, in Western Europe and North America, they're going to adopt a civil service exam. Oh my goodness gracious me. That civil service exam, we talked about that in freaking China. Guess what? European countries are doing it now too. Ain't that amazing? But we also see that eventually governments are going to reform themselves and they are going to kind of break up big monopolies. They're going to say monopolies are bad for everybody. We should introduce competition into the market. But eventually, these working class parties will argue that governments should respect the right for workers to form unions. But the big thing that I want to talk about is that governments are going to begin by the end of the 19th century to provide social welfare. Social welfare is government assistance to struggling poor people so that they can have all of their ends meet. For example, we are going to see protections for workers. They will limit how long they can work. Governments will limit how long people can work. They're going to say 8 hours is enough for a working day. 8 hours of rest, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of sleep. And in some countries, actually, government is going to respond to kind of the dangerous sanitary conditions of these urban centers. They're going to respond with providing government-assisted health care. That mostly happens in Europe and not the United States. But we also see that countries like Britain will pass laws including the Factory Act and the Mines Act. And both of these laws have the same effect. Basically, they are going to outlaw child labor. They're going to raise the wages of workers. But in a way, they're also going to kind of hurt something that working class women had. And that was the right to work. Because some governments are going to say, well, we need to protect the weakest in society. And according to gender ideology, women are apparently the weakest gender. So that we do see that some of these reforms, well, they are going to make positive changes. It is going to result in women being denied the right to work. In order to protect the least fortunate, governments, well, they're going to ban women labor. You're going to see that this changes by the time we get to World War I. Because guess where all the men are? They're in the war. Where are all the women? They're back home. We need people in factories to make guns. We're eventually going to hire women when we get to the First and Second World Wars. More on that in Unit 7. But another way to improve social conditions is giving people an education. Contrary to what Pink Floyd says, you do need an education. An education is going to allow for greater social mobility. Because in a system with no opportunities, then there's no social mobility. If you're born poor, you stay poor. But if you have access to education, you have the opportunity to get a better job. You can become a professionalized white-collar worker and not have to go to a factory. So I want you to talk to your neighbor, virtually or not virtually. Think to yourself. How have governments changed over time? How has their responsibility in the economy changed over time throughout the 1800s? All right. Now, one last slide. This slide is largely, hey, we will talk about this later. Because even though in Western Europe, we don't see much government involvement in the economy in starting the Industrial Revolution, well, outside Western Europe, we will see government involvement in starting the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution in Western Europe and North America was largely done by individuals that were responding to those forces like supply and demand, the invisible hand of the economy. But outside Western Europe, we are going to see that the government, they're going to intervene to directly build factories. Rather than having a private individual put their own resources up to build a factory, well, governments outside of Western Europe, they directly fund industrialization. And we're going to see that primarily the way that governments outside Western Europe start industrialization is through a couple of ways. One way is through having tariffs. Now, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. So goods coming into a country. Countries that are industrialized, like Britain, they can make their goods really cheaply. That is what gives Western Europe the competitive edge over China and India in terms of manufacturing. Western European countries can produce their products very cheaply. And as such, kind of tariffs are implemented by non-Western countries to put a tax on British incoming goods. Now, a tariff is designed to promote domestic industrialization. Let's say you're Egypt, for example. Egypt is outside of Western Europe. Very obvious fact right there. But Egypt, as we'll learn about in Unit 6, they're going to try to industrialize. But the British can make manufactured goods cheaper. So Egyptian consumers, they're going to buy British. So the Egyptian government is going to place a tariff on British imported goods. It makes British goods more expensive, and it makes those Egyptian industrial made goods, those are cheaper by comparison. That's how a tariff helps an unindustrialized country. But we also see that countries outside of Western Europe will adopt what we call a command economy. And a command economy, to put it in very simple terms, I want you to make this. I want you to build a factory. And I'm telling you to do that because I'm the government. I am commanding you to do these certain economic practices. Governments outside of Western Europe also promote education to train inventors, to train people knowledgeable in machinery. But governments also outside of Western Europe, they also are going to send what we call foreign observers. For example, in Japan, the Meiji government, which we'll talk about in Unit 7, they are going to send observers over to England and the United States and Germany to see how factories work there and bring that information back to the home country. The problem with this industrialization outside of North America, Western Europe, and Japan as well, is that, well, Western countries can offset the tariff expense by producing goods so much more cheaply. Mechanization, the use of machines in the producing process, that's what drives costs so low for consumer products in the Western world. You'll learn more about this in Unit 6, but another way that governments outside of Western Europe fail to industrialize is Western European meddling. Western Europeans, as we will learn about, and the United States, they will invade countries in order to break up tariffs, in order to allow for the freedom of Western countries to sell what they want in places like Africa and Asia and Latin America. But countries outside of Western Europe and North America and Japan also are going to have a lot of internal problems. There are civil wars going on. There's disagreements over how to implement all of these policies here. So in this atmosphere of political instability, well, the government is not effective at actually promoting industrialization. They're focused on other things than the economy. Stupid. That's a quote from a guy named James Carville. He's not a good guy. Anyway. And we'll take a look at these three examples more in future units. For example, in Unit 6, we'll take a look at Muhammad Ali, not the boxer. We'll take a look at the Meiji Restoration in Unit 7. And in Unit 6, we'll take a look at China's self-strengthening movement. More on that later. All right. So there's a lot of videos that you can watch. I'm done right here. That was it for this video. I hope you had an excellent day. God bless America. Sorry I couldn't be there today. I am getting a dentist cleaning. My teeth are filthy. No, they're fine. It's just a checkup. All right. I've never had a cavity, actually. That's my fact, my fast 5 fact right there. No cavities. Sugar that touches these lips. Never mind. All right. Have a great day. Have an excellent 4th period. Thank you. I believe I don't want to date this video too. It's Mr. Velasco. Thank you, Mr. Velasco, for stubbing in for today. God bless. All right. Bye. How do I stop recording? Oh, there it is.